Honorable the President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation. Announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator the Honorable Franklin Cann and Senator the Honorable Dennis Moses, both of whom are out of the country, and to Senator H.R. Ian Roach, who is ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the President, Paula May Weeks. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Ms. Ayana Liba Lewis, whereas Senator the Honorable Franklin Cann is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Acting Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Ayana Liba Lewis, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 5th of July 2018 and continuing during the absence out of the country of Senator the Honorable Franklin Cann. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President St. Anne's, this 4th day of July 2018. To Mr. Garvin Simonet, whereas Senator the Honorable Dennis Moses is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Acting Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Garvin Simonet, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 5th of July 2018 and continuing during the absence out of the country of Senator the Honorable Dennis Moses. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President St. Anne's, this 4th day of July 2018. To Ms. Zola L. Phillips, whereas Senator Ian Roach is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of illness. Now, therefore, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Zola L. Phillips, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 5th of July 2018 and continuing during the absence of Senator Ian Roach by reason of illness, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President St. Anne's, this 4th day of July 2018. Honorable Senators, Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Ayana Lewis, having been appointed a Member of Parliament
do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I'm about to enter.
I, Garvin Simonet, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Zola Phillips, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives. The Anti-Terrorism Amendment Bill 2018, in the name of the Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 62(1)B, I beg to move that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. All in favour say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The next stage of the bill will be taken later in the proceedings.
Petitions, papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honour to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Finance to the 11th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, 3rd session, 2017 to 2018, 11th Parliament, on the examination of the audited financial statements of the National Maintenance, Training and Security Company Limited for the financial years 2008 to 2016. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Agricultural Development Bank of Trinidad and Tobago for the years ended September 30, 2014 and September 2015. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago Children Authority Fund for the year ended September 30, 2016. Thank you, Madam President.
Reports from committees, urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honourable Minister of Education. In light of reports that approximately 2,000 students enrolled in private schools will need new accommodations if the issue with the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Private Secondary Schools is not addressed. What is being done to resolve this issue?
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Madam President. 19,100 students wrote the 2018 SAA exam. I am pleased to say that all 19,800 students have been placed. Thank you very much.
Senator Mark.
Can I ask the Honourable Minister through you whether the conflict or the controversy surrounding this matter involving the school, that is the Private Secondary School Association, has been resolved? Madam President, may I through you?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. As far as the Minister and the Ministry of Education are concerned, there is no conflict. The situation is simply that the private secondary schools principals have asked the Ministry for an increase in the stipend that is paid for students to occupy their schools. That matter has engaged the attention of the Ministry, first of all, through discussions with the principals of the private secondary schools, and secondly, through discussions at our level. Only today, the Permanent Secretary gave me a copy of our position, which will be discussed further at our Strategic Executive Team meeting. When that is done, a note will be taken to Cabinet, and Cabinet will decide, and we'll get back to the Association of Principals of the Private Secondary Schools. Let me reiterate, as far as we are concerned, there is no controversy, there is no conflict. Thank you very much.
Senator Mark.
Can the Honourable Minister indicate to this Honourable Senate whether the resolution to this matter involving whatever new changes required in terms of payments would be resolved before the beginning of the new term in September, where all the students would have to be placed, the 2,000, at the level of the private secondary schools?
Minister.
I am still at wits to understand Senator Mark, because I've just stated that all 19,100 students have been placed. And they have been placed in government schools, in government-assisted schools, at 3 private secondary schools, and at several life centers. On the other hand, we are working feverishly to ensure that the private principals would get an increase in their stipend as soon as possible. I want to give the assurance that before the end of this month, a note will be taken to Cabinet, and Cabinet, being the final arbiter where this is concerned, will decide.
Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of Education. In light of the SEA results, which revealed that some 2,500 students scored below 30%, can the Minister advise as to what will be done to help these students?
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, it's a fact that 2,597 students have scored under 30% in the SAA 2018 exam. Of that amount, 932 who were under 13 years old would benefit from an additional year in the primary school, and therefore they are required to resit the examination in 2019. These students have been identified, and specific support will be provided in literacy and numeracy. Support for teachers and the students will also be provided by school supervisors, student support services, and the curriculum officers through clinical supervision and the teaching and learning strategies for students who may have challenges to learning. The remaining 1,665 students have been placed in several junior life centers and government secondary schools where an adapted Form 1 curriculum will be implemented with a focus on numeracy, literacy, visual and performing arts, and technology education. Support for teachers and students will also be provided by school supervisors, student support services, curriculum officers, through training of teachers and remedial strategies. Thank you very much.
Madam President, through you to the Honourable Minister, can the Minister indicate whether the Ministry has done a socio-economic psychological analysis of those students who have scored below 30% to determine what really would have caused this particular development, having regard to the fact that it's the first time in the last few years we have gone so low with so many students?
Minister.
Madam President, the question that has been asked by Senator Mark is a bit premature. The results have just been issued. Those students who have scored below 30%, they will have the assistance of officers from our Student Support Services Division who will be doing all the required analyses. And therefore, I must say that this question is premature.
Madam President, can I ask through you to the Honourable Minister, can you share with us, given the experience that we have now had, whether the Ministry has begun to think through this situation carefully with a view to putting in place the necessary systems to avoid a repeat of same as we approach the 2019 SCA program, Madam President, whether he can share with us what systems may be contemplated.
Minister.
Madam President, at long last, Senator Mark is asking a question that makes sense. At long last.
Why is this?
What we have done at the level of the Ministry is to put things in place so that those students will be able to benefit from the education that we have to offer. For example, we have put in place what we refer to as a student monitoring system, where we are looking at students from infant 1 right on to standard 5 in the primary schools, and in the secondary schools from Form 1 to Form 3, where we are looking carefully. In addition to that, as I've been saying over and over, we have been supplying resources in terms of experts in education who have been assisting the teachers in the classroom at ensuring that they are able to deal effectively with the curriculum. In addition to that, we have mandated that school supervisors should visit the schools on a more regular basis so that they can lend the necessary support to the principal and the students. And of course, our curriculum officers have been visiting schools, meeting with teachers, discussing with teachers how best they can implement the curriculum and strategies that can be used. And finally, we have embarked on a system that is referred to as parenting in education, where we are engaging the active assistance of our parents in education so that, first of all, they will help the teachers in identifying any deficiencies or any challenges that the students can come up with. And in the case of that identification, first of all, the Student Support Services Division, which is staffed with competent professionals, they will be able to provide the necessary support. If it is beyond them, then they will be referred to the Ministry of Health, and have the Minister of Health here, who has been working together with the Ministry of Education at ensuring that our students receive the necessary support. Thank you very much.
Questions on notice. Questions for oral answer.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I'm pleased to advise that the government will respond to all 4 questions which are due for response today. Those are 152, 164, 165, and 166. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 152 to the Minister of Health.
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam President. There are specific nursing shortages in the areas of midwife, licensed midwife, registered mental nurse, district health visitor, district nurse, ICU nurse, oncology nurse, pediatric nurse, and psychiatric nurse. The following steps are being taken to reduce these shortages. 1, short-term measures. Increase collaboration with key stakeholders, such as the Tertiary Education and Skills Training Division, Ministry of Education, on the implementation of required training programs for nursing specializations, such as midwifery, trauma and emergency, neonatal, renal, and theater. 2, recruitment of foreign healthcare professionals by December 2018 from Cuba to fill critical areas of shortage for nursing specializations, such as ICU and midwifery. This is being facilitated under the new technical cooperation agreement between the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and the government of the Republic of Cuba that was signed in April 2018 for the recruitment of healthcare professionals from Cuba during an official visit to that country. Conduct of a training needs assessment to identify core training needs and competencies as required under key areas of nursing specializations, and the utilization and expansion of in-service development programs on the virtual campus for public health to allow for in-service training, curricular enhancements, and online skills development. It is expected that this will be expanded into a regional approach which allows for standardization of skills development and foster greater cooperation across the Caribbean region in addressing the human resources for health challenges. 2, medium-term measure. Finalization of a memorandum of understanding between the Ministry of Health, the regional health authorities, and tertiary education institutions, namely UE, COSTAT, and UTT, to facilitate the use of RHA facilities for internships, projects, and pre-service and specialization training. 3, medium and long-term measures. Discussions with the local tertiary education institutions to expand their range of programs to include courses not currently offered but are needed by the health sector. Example, training for the advanced practice nurse, medical physicists, and community health nurses. This will be less expensive than foreign-based training, and where there's an absence of training at local tertiary education institutions, scholarships will be used to train locals in specific areas of need, including cardiologists and neurologists. Madam President, I thank you.
Yeah, Madam President, can I ask, through you, to the Honorable Minister, what is the current number of personnel outlined by the Honorable Minister that are needed to ensure that the healthcare system is smoothly or is allowed to smoothly function in Trinidad and Tobago?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. According to the nursing specialties, we have about 517 vacant posts, and the nursing specialties vacancies from the RHAs as of May 2018, 326. But, Madam Speaker, these vacancies notwithstanding, it has not prevented the healthcare system for the first time in the history of this country to go 6 calendar months without a maternal death. That is the first time this country has achieved that. And we as a nation owe a debt of gratitude to our obstetricians, our midwives and nurses, that we are now ranked among the advanced countries after 2.5 years as far as maternal mortality rates are concerned. That is a phenomenal achievement. Another phenomenal achievement we are making, and I will disclose these figures very soon, is our advances in infant mortality rates. For the past 2 years, we have been focusing on these shortages and filling them. And because of filling those shortages, our infant mortality rates are coming down in tandem with our maternal mortality rates. Also, Madam President, under our friends there, because I know Senator Amin has a particular interest in cardiology at Eric Williams, when we came into office, there was a 5-year waiting time for echocardiograms. You had 3,500 persons under the UNC who could not get an echocardiogram. I wonder how many of those died and went to heaven and could not get the results of their echocardiogram. We have now treated with that. Madam President, under my friends, cardiac clinics had 250 people in one clinic, and they had to wait 6 months for an appointment. I want to tell Senator Amin through you, because she has a particular interest in this, we have reduced those clinics from 250 to 70. That is what we are doing, as Senator Mark will say, to make it smoother, to oil it. So, Madam President, we have done all of these things without building a new facility in Couva. We have fixed the existing structures. We have empowered people. We have the leadership, and we have the political commitment to do things in the health sector which were never done before in the history of this country. I thank you again, Madam President.
Madam President, through you, can I ask the Honourable Minister, what time frame is he anticipating for the filling of the 843 vacancies in the healthcare system?
We are working assiduously. As I said, we will be recruiting from Cuba in some instances. We have put short-term measures in place, but I will tell you, under OBS and GYNs through the 4 RHAs, we have already hired 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 consultants and SMOs. In radiology, we have hired 5. In pediatrics, we have hired 3 registrars, 2 SMOs, 1 consultant. In emergency medicine, we have hired 6 registrars, 2 SMOs, and all of this in the past year. It could not have been done under the UNC. So we are doing it. Under neurosurgery, we have hired 2 SMOs, Madam President. Oncology, 2 SMOs. Dermatology, 2 SMOs. General surgery, 3 SMOs, 2 registrars, 1 consultant. Ophthalmology, 1 SMO. Cardiology, 2 registrars. That is why we could have attended to the 3,500 patients waiting under the UNC for echocardiogram, that many of them went to heaven without knowing their status. Internal medicine, we have hired 5 registrars. Psychiatry, 1 SMO. Gastroenterology, 1 SMO. We have done all of this in the past year. So we are moving to fill as many vacancies as possible that were left empty, that were left vacant by those that went before us. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Mark?
Yes, Madam President, after all those areas that the Honourable Minister has mentioned in terms of filling, we still have 800 vacancies still left to be filled. I'm asking the Honourable Minister, given the roadmap he has set himself, what time frame does the Minister anticipate for these 800 vacancies to be filled under his stewardship, which is 2 years from now, before you're removed from office?
Senator Mark, you just asked that question to the Minister.
But you didn't answer.
Senator Mark, you can pose another question. You have 1 more.
Can I ask, Madam President, through you, whether the Minister can advise this Parliament as to the status of the Nursing Training Academy, which is essential for executing training activities for the nurses and other healthcare professionals in the system. What is the status?
Minister.
President, it is unfortunate that Senator Mark missed my substantive answer. It is rather unfortunate. There is something called cerebral airdrops, which I recommend. I said plainly and clearly, increase collaboration with key stakeholders. I will have to repeat it, such as Tertiary Education and Skills Training Division. I have said clearly, the utilization and expansion of in-service development programs on the virtual campus for public health. I have said clearly a finalization of the Memorandum of Understanding between the Ministry of Health, the regional RHAs, the tertiary education institutions, namely UE, COSTAT, and UTT, to facilitate the use of RHA facilities for nursing training. Madam President, I may also add, for the first time in the history of this country, we are rationalizing the curricula across the nursing schools. Because what you have are about 4 or 5 nursing schools using different curricula, but all of these students have to sit the same exam. And that gives you a false high failure rate. So what we are doing is working with the Ministry of Education to standardize the curricula across all the nursing schools. University of the West Indies, the same entity Senator Mark spoke about, because unless you have the adequate number of nurses coming through, you can't hire them. And one of the reasons for the high failure rate of nursing is that you have 5 schools using 5 curricula, but the students have to write the same exam. So we are working with the Ministry of Education and have been for the past year and a half to standardize the curriculum so nurses stand a better chance of writing a studying a standardized course and writing the same exam, and you have a higher chance of passing so that you could have more nurses and so that we could hire more nurses in the shortest possible time. Again, Madam President, I thank you very much.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you. Madam President, question number 164 to the Minister of Works and Transport.
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the answer is no. The government has not yet acquired the K-Order drive-in in Curep. At present, the relevant state agencies, namely the Office of the Commissioner of State Land and the Office of the Commissioner of Valuations, are in negotiations with Valsin Resorts Limited, which has an interest in the property. These negotiations have not yet completed. As such, part 2 of the question is not applicable. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate what time frame is being set for the various stakeholders to conclude negotiations having regard to the importance of the interchange that you are to build for that particular part of the island? Any particular time frame that you have decided upon for concluding these negotiations so that work could progress on this construction exercise involving the exchange, the Curep exchange?
Minister.
Thank you. Madam President, work is going on at the Curep interchange while the land acquisition process is underway. If I am just to draw a reference of the land acquisition in the San Fernando to Point Fortin Highway, which started, I think, in 2011, land acquisition process is still ongoing in that area. I don't, because of the system that this government is using, which is compulsory acquisition, I don't expect it to take that long. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Can the Minister share with us on what basis is the work progressing or proceeding at this particular location involving the Curep interchange? Because there is work going on there this time, and can you advise this Honourable House on what basis, under what conditions this work is being proceeded with?
Senator Mark, that question doesn't arise. Next question.
Can I ask the Honourable Minister to outline for our edification the personnel involved in the Valsin Resource Limited?
Senator,
You mentioned vaccine resource.
yes, but that question also does not arise. You have one more.
Well, the only question I'd like to ask the Honourable Minister is whether the government intends to approach the negotiations only from under the land acquisition perspective, or whether there will be a combination of land acquisition and private treaty arrangement as it relates to speeding up this process.
Minister.
President, at this point in time, Cabinet have approved the compulsory acquisition. However, a subsequent note will be taken to Cabinet as the negotiation continues in order to bring a speedy settlement to the relative parties. But as we speak, the process that is being used is compulsory acquisition. Thank you.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Yes. Question number 165 to the Minister of Works and Transport.
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in relation to the Inter-Island Ferry, the Trinidad and Tobago Spirit, and the Trinidad and Tobago Express, the total amount spent on repairs to the vessels as at April 30th, 2018 is as follows. The TNT Express dry docking May 2017 to April 2018, US $10,199,698.50. TNT Express repairs and maintenance for May 17, 2017 to March 12, 2018, US $807,117.60. A detailed breakdown of these repairs is being circulated to the Honorable House now.
Senator Mark.
Whilst it's being circulated, Madam President, which I have yet to see, and I'm happy for that detailed breakdown, can the Minister share with us some of the key elements that constituted the breakdown of repairs in terms of cost for the TNT Spirit, some of the key elements you consider to be
Minister.
crucial?
Madam President, my information is once you're dealing with vessels, every element is a key element, because these vessels have to work on the ocean, and unless the approvals from the relevant authorities, meaning the maritime organizations, the Lloyd's inspectors, are fulfilled, every element is a key element. And I can say there are almost 100 different areas that were looked at. That is why the information has been circulated. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Yeah, Madam President, can the Minister indicate to this Senate whether the projected value attached to the repair of this vessel exceeded what the government had budgeted for when that vessel went on to the dry dock or went to dry dock? Can you tell us what was the projected estimated figure for that particular exercise?
Minister.
Thank you. Madam President, one can recall that this vessel was taken out of service for its annual dry docking. However, subsequent to that event, several things like the shaft of the vessel failed. So the dry docking, which was expected to just last about 3 months, ended up lasting close to 11 months because of the intense repairs that the vessel had to undergo. I must put on the record that a vessel like this, brand new, is in excess of $1 billion. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Yes, Madam President, can the Honourable Minister indicate whether the shaft that he talked about that cost a couple hundreds of thousands of dollars, can you clarify that first? What was the value of that particular part for the vessel, the TNT Spirit?
Well, Senator Mark, the particulars have been circulated, so I don't...
Well, can I answer the question, Madam President?
Yes, you have one more.
Can I ask the Honourable Minister whether the TNT Spirit ran aground. Are you aware of that vessel running aground? And subsequently, critical parts of that vessel may have been damaged. Are you aware of this?
No, well, Senator Mark, I won't allow that question.
Okay.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Question number 166, I think, to the Honorable Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Madam Chair, Madam President, the rental of the Children's Court at Faizabad is to the sum of $150,000 VAT exclusive per month.
Senator Mark.
Is this city or U.S.? Honorable Minister.
Currency of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is known to everybody since our independence. Is that a serious question?
No, but I'm going to clarify something.
Yes, next
Can you show this house who are the owners, the landlord of this building?
Sure. For the umpteenth time, driving to the umpteenth question as to whether the Minister of Energy, Mr. Franklin Khan's relative, is involved. Yes, it is his wife for the 100th time, in answer to you, Senator Mark. That was secured, the building, by the judiciary in the period prior to this government coming into office for the 100th time, Senator Mark. And there's no shame or difficulty in somebody conducting arm's length distance with the state. The building was secured by the judiciary, rented in accordance with the work started by the UNC, and for the millionth time, Mrs. Franklin Khan is involved. There is nothing wrong with that.
Next question,
I
Senator
don't understand
Mark.
why he's upset. I didn't say it was wrong.
Senator Mark, next
Madam
question.
President, may I continue?
You have two more questions, if you wish.
I don't know why he's getting hot under the collar. Madam President, through you, I'm just asking the Honorable Minister, can the Attorney General tell this Parliament when the contract involving the landlord and the judiciary was formally signed? Could you tell us the date that agreement was executed for the rental of that particular property?
Attorney General.
I believe the judiciary has just recently, pursuant to the manner in which this works, and I'll explain. Once premises are identified, they then follow a process of inspection and approvals by the Ministry of Public Admin. The premises were identified by the judiciary in the period 2015 prior to the general election. It was known then that Mrs. Khan was the owner of the building, as it is now known that she's in fact the owner of the building via her shareholding in the limited liability company that owns the premises. After that happens, the cabinet notes proceed, and then eventually, in fact, it takes up to a year after these things for the lease arrangements to be put on. I could not give a specific date for that, but I want to state, Madam President, because these things get twisted out of shape. The question is there value for money? Was there a recusal by Minister Khan in the process? Yes, there was. Was it selected by the judiciary? Yes, it was. Does it have all planning permission, consents, etc.? Yes, it does. One need not hide behind the allegation that somebody is related to someone when the business is done at arm's length and is for value for money. No citizen in this country should be deprived a genuine right of value for money transactions done at arm's length, and in this case particularly so where the judiciary is the entity that secured the premises. I'm pleased to say that this children's court is up and running, successfully so, with hundreds of cases going to the effect of the relief of our citizens of this country who are the most vulnerable. I hope I've answered my learned colleagues' itching inquiries that he has made for 100 times on umpteen occasions. There is nothing to hide.
Senator Mark.
I don't know about itching, and I don't know about overwhelming. This is the first time I'm asking.
Who's that?
I am asking in the Senate. Madam President, may I ask, through you, can the Honorable Attorney General indicate whether he's aware that the Auditor General has indicated that a number of contracts that have been entered into between the judiciary and other parties could not have been presented when the Auditor General visited the compound of the judiciary?
Senator,
are you aware of this?
No, Senator Mark, no, Attorney General. That question does not arise.
And do I have a final?
No, that's it.
That's
yeah.
Okay. Madam President, no. Listen, I'm addressing the President.
Yes, Senator Mark.
I'm being interrupted.
No, ask me.
Madam President, can you advise this Honourable House what is the status or status of question 121 that has been languishing for a long, long time on the order paper, and also the status of question 13 for written response in the appendix? Can you advise us?
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I recall that the standing order was invoked in relation to 121, and the government has not complied as yet. Thank you.
Madam President, can you advise this House when standing order 27, I think 9, is invoked, and there's a particular period for the government to respond, and that would have been a long period of time, Madam President, and the government has failed? What are the sanctions available to the Senate?
Senator Mark, those issues, I think please have a seat. The standing order has been invoked. The Acting Leader of Government Business has given an update, but I would ask him to get a further update for the next occasion.
One, I didn't get a response to that one. The appendix, in the appendix.
Yes, to both. That's
to both, okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Attorney General.
Madam President, without procedure, I'll go from memory. Madam President, I beg to move that an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act, Chapter 1207, a bill to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act, Chapter 1207, be now read a second time. Madam President, I'm very pleased to approach this Honourable Senate to ask for its consideration for the second reading in this House of the bill which has already passed through the House of Representatives. Permit me to explain exactly what we have, what the legislative purpose standing behind this is, what the satisfaction that the bill is intended to deliver is specifically, what the consequences of passage or lack of passage of this legislation will result in, and what some of the finer issues coming into the public domain have been. Madam President, the scourge of terrorism in the world is something which is not new. Terrorism has existed for perhaps as long as humanity has. Terrorism has been defined on a number of occasions. There was terror committed during the Spanish Inquisition. There was terror committed during slavery. There was terror committed perhaps during indentureship. There was terror committed in the wars that have been fought in our country. There was certainly a significant amount of terror which came to focal point really when the United Nations gathered together after the savagery of World War II in particular. When the United Nations was born, the world took note of a need to have an international matrix to treat with what resembles atrocities to humanity. In particular, we have seen the concept of terrorism evolve over the years, and the litmus test for that is perhaps best examined in the United Nations Security Council resolutions. We've seen the conventions move year after year from what was then known as acts of savagery to humanity. We're all familiar with hijacking as it prevailed in the 1960s. We're familiar with the use of chemical weapons as it then came into vogue, if you want to put it that way, in terms of the manner in which things happened. We're familiar with the acts of the IRA. We're familiar with bombings. We're familiar with the threat of what chemical weapons look like in terms of distribution worldwide, even in things like packaging and postal services. It was really when we started to come into the 1990s that the modern concepts of terrorism became known. And when we passed through the reflections in the year 1999, we see that the United Nations began to be very specific as to what terror involved. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1267 came about on the 15th of October 1999. It took all of a matter of minutes for the United Nations to treat with it. And I'll remind that at the 15th of October 1999, the big topic of conversation then was a man named Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which is just a simple Arabic word which means the base literally in Arabic. Al-Qaeda was then very much in gear, and the United Nations came together and said that a sanctions regime had to be implemented, and it consolidated lists and entities. That's where we first really started this modern trot. In the year 2001, the United Nations came together again. UNSCR 1373 came about on the 28th of September 2001, just after September 11th, 2001 had happened. It took the United Nations all of 5 minutes precisely between 9:55 p.m. and 10 p.m. for the United Nations to say that they would criminalize terrorism and ask every member of the UN to criminalize terrorism in domestic law, every member of the UN, and that there would be a sharing of information and intelligence. That was 2001. We had UNSCR 1988, which came about in 2011, on the 17th of June 2011. And what the United Nations did then was to split its 1267 list, that's the bin Laden lists, into 2 lists. And in 2011, focal point came about to seizing and freezing assets, designation of individuals, prevention of in-transit travel. We then came to 2015, where UNSCR 2253 was born, where an expression of sanctions and a framework was further put into particulars. The 2 targets of attack then was ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, and we had Al-Qaeda, Daesh. Again, just simple references to Arabic words which have now become synonymous with terrorism. In that 2253, we also saw the 1267 and 1989 committees established, and the UN established named committees, the Al-Qaeda Sanction Committee and the ISIL-Daesh Al-Qaeda Sanction Committee. Those committees came about. Madam President, I've taken time to put out what the United Nations has said, because our laws, as they became known to us, really flow from our international obligations, as is now very relevantly confined to domestic circumstance. Let me explain that. Does terrorism exist in Trinidad and Tobago? Are we at risk of terrorism? Is there a potential effect to our economy? Yes. How do we know that? We have had named individuals of our country step forward into the international arena and say to the world, I am from Trinidad and Tobago. I call upon Muslims globally and Muslims in my country to step forward and support the ideology of ISIS or ISIL, and that blood must spill on the streets. Who are these people? Shane Crawford stands #1 on that list. Shane Crawford in the Dabiq magazine went to the world and put Trinidad and Tobago on the map of terrorism. Shane Crawford even went so far as to rechristen himself Saad a Trinidadi. You know what Saad means in Arabic? It means happiness. Happiness from Trinidad and Tobago became born to the world. That's the distinction we have in the global world. Shane Crawford wasn't alone. Shane Crawford was dealt with by a number of accomplices. Algernon is one of them. Glasgow, known to us. Then we had Kareem Ibrahim, convicted in the United States of America in a terror plot to blow up JFK Airport. These are Trinidadians and Tobagonians, well known to the country. In fact, my learned colleagues opposite arrested Shane Crawford, arrested Glasgow, arrested Algernon in the state of emergency that the leader of the opposition, when as Prime Minister, called. But where do we stand? Does our economy have a risk? Trinidad and Tobago, having raised its flag in the international arena, having a population of 1.4 million odd people, with approximately 10% of that population residing in the Islamic support and background, has now become known as the subject of conversation globally. News media, cameras, reporters, photographers have arrived in Trinidad and Tobago to talk about a skewed statistic where they say that we have the highest per capita contribution for the phenomenon now known as foreign terrorist fighters in the world. What does that mean? It is alleged that there are approximately 135 persons, including women and children, who left Trinidad and Tobago in pursuit of ISIS ideology and found themselves as foreign terrorist fighters. 135 is a minuscule number from the tens of thousands of ISIS foreign terrorist fighters, the large majority of whom, the thousands of whom, have come from North America, from Europe, from Asia, and from countries that have contributed significantly to this dynamic. But are they being extrapolated in the manner that Trinidad and Tobago is? No, they're not. So internationally now, we have this phenomenon and this infamy of having foreign terrorist fighters. But, Madam President, the submission to the honorable members of the Senate is that one person identified as a supporter of ISIS ideology is one too many for us. Number one, we don't want that infamy. Number two, there is a risk to our economy for events like this. People don't know that as an oil and gas exploration country and producing country, the British Petroleum Company, BP, as a global producer, having its stock exchange pegged to its trading globally, that 17% of BP's global production is made right here in Trinidad and Tobago. Right here. 17% of the global economy. If one terrorist were to find himself inside of here and rock our platforms that produce oil and gas, the world economy is affected. So the international obligations upon Trinidad and Tobago coincide with our domestic position. Madam President, it's not by mistake that we got here. Trinidad and Tobago, being a member of the United Nations, participating in the UN SCRs that I've just read out, in particular those coming from the year 1999, straight up to today's date, we have had a history of obligations because we joined the Financial Action Task Force methodology in 1999, when in 1998 we comprised something called the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. Let me explain that. 190 countries from around the world have signed on to a methodology called the Financial Action Task Force methodology. They produce 40 recommendations and they have 10 immediate outcomes. And of those 190 countries, 9 FATF-style regional bodies, or FSRBs as they're called, were comprised. In our neck of the woods, there's something called the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, which now comprises 25 countries, but which had 27 countries. There are others around the world, like GAFILAT and MENA FATF, etc., the APG, the Asian Pacific, the Middle Eastern countries, the South American countries. But they all follow the same methodology. And Madam President, In 1995, before the formation of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, is when Trinidad and Tobago underwent its first mutual evaluation. We've had mutual evaluation number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And number 4, the fourth round mutual evaluation, is the one that brings us to this Parliament today. Madam President, in 2007 to 2008, there was a lot of discussion as to what really ought to happen in our country, but it flowed right back to the year 2005. And let me put onto the record, in 2005, Trinidad and Tobago birthed anti-terrorism legislation. It has now stood on the books of Trinidad and Tobago for over 13 years. In 2005, we anchored that bedrock. In 2010, we came to amend the laws for anti-terrorism. In 2011, we amended the laws. In 2012, we amended the laws. In 2014 and 2015, we amended the laws. And Madam President, in 2005, the legislation which came to the Parliament, then as simple majority legislation, really dealt with the UN SCRs 1267 and 1373. In 2010, the PNM government, as it stood then, came with very important amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act, putting into effect the whole requirement for the financial side of it. Designated entities, treating with the financing of terrorism as a very important part, bringing to life the FIU's operationality in what is Section 22A, the listing phenomenon in Section 22B. In 2010, that came the amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act, together with the Financial Obligations Regulations, the Financial Intelligence Unit Act, and with amendments to the Proceeds of Crime Act. In 2010, that legislation was special majority legislation, fully supported by the then Parliament that sat. In 2011, Madam President, we saw amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act done with simple majority. In that bill, we specifically, under the hand of a UNC Minister of National Security, Brigadier John Sandy, saw amendments to sections 22AA, that's the section which treats with the FIU and the interrelationship between the FIU and the Attorney General in particular. It dealt with amendments to section 22B, which deal with the interaction between the Attorney General and the High Court for the listing of terrorist entities. In 2012, under then Senator Anand Ramlogan as Attorney General, special majority legislation was brought, unanimously passed, no joint select committees in any of these three bills that I've mentioned. We again fattened the powers of the Attorney General under Section 22AA, where the FIU and the Attorney General have relationship. We fattened the powers in 22AB. We fattened the powers in 22E. We fattened the powers in Section 34, in Section 42. We caused amendment by way of reflection to Section 22B, all treating with the Attorney General's role under the 2012 UNC bill. I'll skip and come up now to the Act number 15 of 2014, where Senator Hawai, the UNC Minister of Finance, came with special majority legislation, everybody voting yes, no joint select committee, where we expand definition of terrorist property. We fatten the Section 22AA features and 22A features of the Attorney General. We fatten 22C, 24B. We again treat with reflections to 22B. Madam President, we then come to the fact that Trinidad and Tobago was invited to go into the fourth round mutual evaluation at CFATF. May I ask precisely what time I must end in full time?
You end at 3:32.
Thank you. You see, the time is nowhere near sufficient to really treat with the full subject matter, so I'll do my best. But in 2015, January 2015, Trinidad and Tobago underwent its fourth round mutual evaluation by CFATF. And in that fourth round mutual evaluation, Trinidad and Tobago presented itself for analysis as to whether we have technical compliance. Do we have laws to treat with what FATF says we must? And it also underwent an analysis as to how effective our laws are. Are your laws working? We were committed to being first in the CFATF pot and one of the first countries in the world to undergo fourth-round mutual evaluation by the Deputy Chairman of CFATF, Senator Anand Ramlogan, that is the UNC Attorney General, put us first in the pack. Coming out of that mutual evaluation, which was presented to the world in September 2015, when I had become Attorney General, Trinidad and Tobago was given a checklist of amendments that we must make to our legislation. We were obliged to undertake a work program, identify what was to be done, and that work program saw us having to speak to specific deficiencies identified by the Financial Action Task Force through the FSRB, that is the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. And specifically, they found that we were deficient in Recommendation 5, which relates to terrorist financing offenses, and also Recommendation 6, which treats with targeted financial sanctions related to terrorism and terrorism financing. And that, of course, had a reflection upon our immediate outcome number 10, which is our efficiency matrix. Specifically, we were told in our mutual evaluation report that we have no specific provisions for proposals to the UN SCR for the 1267 and 1989 committees, that we have no mechanisms for identifying targets for designation as required by the UN Security Council resolutions, that we had no specific measures provided to facilitate the collection or solicitation of information to identify persons and entities who meet the criteria for designation pursuant to the UN SCRs, that we have no provision to facilitate the 1373 UN SCR listings upon request from other countries, that all of the requirements and procedures for freezing funds or assets were not covered in our Anti-Terrorism Act, that no provision expressly prohibiting nationals, persons, entities from Trinidad and Tobago making funds, assets, or financial services available for the benefit of designated persons or entities existed. That the rights of bona fide third parties were not fully covered. And lastly, that there were no measures for resubmitting delisting requests in respect of the UN SCR committees. Those were the 8 specific identified markers, latter being in reference, the last 8 being in reference to Recommendation 6. And in relation to Recommendation 5, specifically, we were obliged to criminalize terrorist financing in a very specific way. And we were also obliged by Recommendation 5.2 BIS, BIS as it's referred to, that terrorist financing offenses should include financing the travel of individuals who travel to a state other than their states, etc. In other words, then, targeting foreign terrorist fighters. It was that in mind that the government brought a bill in 2017 specifically to treat with the recommendations of the FATF and CFATF. We brought Bill number 9 of 2017. It came onto the order paper. We had deep consultation in respect of it. As a result of commentary coming out of that, we allowed that bill to lapse, and then we introduced Bill number 1 of 2018, which was the bill which was then referred to a joint select committee of the Parliament pursuant to resolutions in both the House and in the Senate. Madam President, those resolutions came about in January 26, 2018, where the Senate passed its resolution, and, sorry, that was the House of Representatives, passed the resolution to the JSC, Friday, January 26, 2018, and in the Senate it was passed on Tuesday, January 30th, 2018. And a committee comprising 12 persons, yours truly, MP MacDonald, MP Hines, MP Robinson-Regis, Dr. Munilal, Mr. Prakash Ramada, the Honorable Sophia Chote, Senior Counsel, the Honorable Nigel de Freitas, the Honorable Clarence Rambarat, the Honorable Foster Cummings, the Honorable Mr. Saddam Hussein, the Honorable Mr. Stephen Crease. That was the 12-man team, 12-member team put together. I'm very pleased to say that the committee worked with diligence. We sat on 12 occasions. We engaged in meetings as set out in the JSE's report, February 16th, 2018, March 9th, March 16th, March 29th, April 10th, April 18th, April 23rd, April 27th, May 16th, May 18th, May 22nd, and very importantly, on June 1st. But between May 22nd and June 1st, we received written communication under the hand of Senator Saddam Hussein asking us to consider certain matters. He was then out of the jurisdiction and wrote on behalf of the opposition team. We specifically reconvened the Joint Select Committee on June 1st to treat with those observations. The committee went through clause by clause every single one of the provisions of the bill, and we did that against a wide array of stakeholder commentary that we received by way of work that we called for. And I'm pleased to say that we received stakeholder submissions from the Law Association, the FIU, the Muslim Roundtable, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, Concerned Muslims of Trinidad and Tobago, the ASJA, and the National Council of Orisha Elders. We were also, Madam President, wider in our approach. There were several other entities that we wrote to who did not bother to reply to us. We then held, at our 7th meeting and 8th meeting, live on-camera stakeholder submissions, in particular with the Muslim Round Group, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, Concerned Muslims of Trinidad and Tobago, the FIU, again with the TTPS. Madam President, that came on the back of the government itself, firstly in the Office of the Attorney General, having stakeholder sessions in GAIR and commentary received, and then also in hostings done under the hand of the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley, at the Diplomatic Center and elsewhere. And Madam President, it was in that circumstance that your committee produced what I thought was an excellent report, and on June 5th, 2018, every single member of the Joint Select Committee, opposition, government, and independent representatives from the independent bench, signed on to the anti-terrorism unanimously. That report of the JSE established to consider the Anti-Terrorism Bill 2018, and the committee, in its unanimous report, asked for certain amendments to be made to the bill, which was tabled appropriately as a new bill, which was then considered in the House of Representatives as it was on several days. Madam President, on July 20th, 2018, the House of Representatives sat. On June 29th, 2018, the House of Representatives sat. On July 3rd, 2018, the House of Representatives sat. And it is now a matter of public record that, quite to our surprise as a government, we received indication from the Leader of the Opposition that there was a requirement that the government reconsider the legislation. There were some very serious observations which were put onto the record. But very importantly, there was one core recommendation which came as a deep surprise to the government and people of Trinidad and Tobago. And that was the insistence by the Leader of the Opposition that the role of the Attorney General in relation to the listing requirement under Section 22B of the Parent Act be redefined, and that the Director of Public Prosecutions replace the Attorney General. The government was taken aback because the truth and fact is that the opposition, as I have read into the record, operated with the system of an Attorney General applying this listing requirement for a full 5 years and 3 months with their Attorneys General, Ram Logan and Nicholas. They, in fact, added more power to their two Attorneys General, Ram Logan and Nicholas, in 2011, 2012, 2014, and 2015. And to say that we were alarmed by the recommendations coming from the opposition is, to put it mildly. Fortunately, as a result of further discussions in the House of Representatives, we dealt with the opposition resiling from that position. We agreed to do some surgery to the bill, removing things which, respectfully, there was a unanimous view by the Joint Select Committee would not cause harm to the bill. We can come to that in the due course of this debate. But suffice it to say, that law of the Attorney General's involvement, standing as it did with the beginning of the Anti-Terrorism Act in 2005, passing through 2010, where the listing became very significant, and onward, was preserved. And the government is grateful that that common sense to our Constitution survived, because it is constitutionally the case that the Attorney General conducts civil litigation on behalf of the government under Section 76(2) of the Constitution, and that the DPP has a very different role in the criminal jurisdiction under Section 90 of the Constitution. Madam President, this bill is a very interesting one. The bill itself is not a very long bill. The bill involves the consideration of, if we look at the bill brought as amended in the House of Representatives, the bill contains 45 clauses. The 45 clauses are specifically well thought out. It's important to note that Clause 5 of the bill treats with a concern as to definitions. And permit me to say that in that definition clause, we harmonized a number of definitions which we amended as a Senate in respect of the miscellaneous provisions, for instance, in treating with matters ancillary to cash, the prohibitions against bearer negotiable instruments, and cash itself. We treated with the broadening of the definition of designated entities to include individuals and entities under the UNSCR listings, etc. We introduced the foreign terrorist fighter in compliance with the observations of recommendation 6.5 bis. We introduced broadening aspects of property. We dealt with how we treat for the definition of terrorist acts and terrorist. But very importantly, in the Joint Select Committee, we took note of a concern coming from the Muslim community that this bill somehow allegedly targets Muslims. And the representation made by members of the Muslim community was that the use of Arabic words, which they pointed to, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Daesh, somehow meant that Muslims were going to be attacked. As an individual and not as a government, I can say here, as someone who is also from another jurisdiction, being Iraq, as my father is Iraqi, I can say I don't agree with that submission. That is like telling me that the use of the English words Ku Klux Klan or Nazi is synonymous with something other than what the terrible scourge of those two entities are. We can, as a nation, agree that ISIS and ISIL can only be in reference to a self-designation of a terrorist entity. I don't buy the concept that Al-Qaeda and Daesh and that ISIL mean anything other than terrorist entities. That notwithstanding, the Joint Select Committee recommended that we remove the Arabic references, and in Clause 5 you will see that we have now gone to the description of the committees, the 1988 committee, etc. At the House of Representatives, the opposition recommended, and we accepted, that we put in definitions for central authority, meaning the Attorney General and the DPP as defined in the clause itself. We've dealt with the resolutions without reference to the Arabic names, and you'll see that under the resolutions 1267, 1989, etc. Very importantly, permit me to point out that Clause 7 of the bill treats with what is terrorism. As I was coming into Parliament this afternoon, I met one of the stakeholders from the concerned Muslim groups and his attorney at law, Mr. Christian Williams. And in the rush to come up here, I didn't have the benefit of a quick conversation, but they expressed to me that they had some further concerns. And their further concerns were this allegation, again, that this bill targets Muslims. So let me put that to bed, Because the question that I have to ask them is, okay, if that's your submission, then tell me how to draft the law, tell the Parliament how to draft the law to not treat with Muslims. And I dare say that that is an impossibility, because this law is only targeted against terrorists, and that is to be found at Clause 7 of the bill, where we define what terrorism is. A person with the intent to compel a government or an international organization to do or refrain from doing any act or intimidate the public or a section of the public for the purpose of advancing a political, ideological, or religious cause, does any act which he intends to cause, creates the likelihood of causing or is likely to cause loss of human life or serious bodily harm, substantial damage to property, endangerment of a person's life other than the life of a person taking action, the creation of a serious risk to the health or safety of the public or a section of the public, prejudice to national security, disruption of public safety, including disruption in emergency services, electronic systems, etc., etc., threatens to commit an act referred to in this part, takes preparatory steps for the purpose of committing an act, coerces, encourages, entices another to commit these offenses, commits an offense of terrorism. Nowhere in there can one find specificity to any religion. And I ask this genuinely of our population: stop bringing onto yourselves and ourselves something which is not. This has no reference to Islam, and I denounce immediately this constant position of saying that this bill treats with Muslims. Timothy McVeigh was not a Muslim. The World Trade Center was still bombed. The IRA is not a Muslim entity. It was a known terrorist entity. FARC from Latin America and Colombia is not a Muslim entity. But none of them step forward and say, this is about me. Catholics don't step forward. Hindus don't step forward. We've had atrocities in Sri Lanka. We've had atrocities in Canada. We've had atrocities in South America. This bill is about protecting 100% of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago and is not targeted to any one grouping. Madam President, we were very careful in this bill to cause surgery to a number of areas where we felt that the risk to our citizens was large. We made sure to amend the mental intention aspect of offenses to ensure that you were not caught easily through some innocent infringement of the law. We've included as a standard clause a person who knowingly and without lawful excuse engages in what we describe as offenses: financing of terrorism, facilitating a purpose, coercing, receiving training, because we were very alive to the fact that many people can be caught in difficult circumstances innocently. And it happens especially with respect to the financing of terrorism. Because it's true to say, one man's freedom fighter may be another man's terrorist. It's true. Nelson Mandela was on a terrorist watch list as a freedom fighter, as the ANC was on a terrorist list, and is today a celebrated hero of humanity. Many of our Muslims in this country and many persons who engage in charity beyond Islam find themselves financing by way of contribution, charitable contribution to many entities: refugees in Syria, refugees in Africa, refugees in South America. And it is true that many states take different views. And in taking different views, for instance, I can tell you of a live case where the government of the United Kingdom has defined a particular charitable organization as worthy of support from His Royal Highness Prince Charles himself, whereas the government of the United States of America considers that entity, the same charitable organization, to be a terrorist entity. And therefore, our people, and in particular our Muslims, who fulfill one of the 5 pillars of Islam in zakat, in charitable donation, found themselves mischaracterized because they're passing through the UK and not through the US. And Madam President, I'm pleased to say that this bill allows us to put that to bed. This bill allows for a very important insertion, and that is for the treating of how we now label foreign terrorist fighters. This phenomenon, where we introduce a new Section 15 to the Parent Act, which really comes about in the new Clause 22, this is essential to meeting the FATF requirements for Recommendation 6.5b, bis, as I've just put it. Madam President, we have, and this is the main architecture as to why we need a 3/5 majority, is this clause. We have said to the world, we will look at the Commonwealth experience, but we will not go so far. We've looked at the Australian model, where there is the characteristic of having a declared geographical zone. A declared geographical zone is only ever going to be a zone declared by the Minister of National Security after telling the leader of the opposition that this is going to be done, and subjecting the order declaring a zone subject to negative resolution of Parliament. That declared geographical zone can only ever be a part of a country. Secondly, we have proposed that travel to that country be subjected to the individual or persons who have responsibility for minors informing the Commissioner of Police either before they leave, whilst they are abroad, or when they come back, that they have been to a declared geographical zone. And that is so that we can do two things. On the one hand, we can have information as to the travel aspects of persons, because we can therefore alert entities along the way of suspicious activities, fulfilling our UNSCR requirements. But very importantly, on the other side, that we can, for the first time ever in Trinidad and Tobago, tell foreign states, you are mischaracterizing our citizens. We know these people who you are blacklisting. They are not who you think they are. Here is their information from a repository as solid as the Commissioner of Police. Because many of our citizens have been mischaracterized. I can tell you, as a descendant of Iraqi origin,
Attorney General, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. That I have been subjected, with the name that I have and the languages that I speak, to secondary screening and triple screening on many occasions, as many of our citizens have. But this allows the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, for the first time, to stand in defense of its citizens. And we do not criminalize their travel. We put a presumption upon them that if they have not told us why, that there's a presumption which they must discharge. But we also provide for the circumstance of what is known as lawful excuse. Look, I didn't know you declared it. There was no way for me to know. I only just found out. Having just found out, I am telling you everything that I know. And now the burden is back on the prosecution. So it's a very carefully balanced structure. Importantly, in terms of cornerstones, part of our public consultation said that we ought not to frivolously manage the treatment of individuals who are on frolics of their own to affect companies. So if a company is involved via one of its directors or officers, in that director or officer acting on his own in supporting financing terrorism, in engaging in terrorist acts, the mere fact that that person is a director ought not to prejudice the entire company. And instead, what we have done is to put that as a standalone. It's only where the company benefited and knew that it benefited from the directors or officers' actions that the company falls into odium. Very importantly, Madam President, an observation made by the members of the opposition in the House included an allegation that the Attorney General was somehow taking new powers onto himself. I want to say that that is not the case when you look at the law in the round. We, the Joint Select Committee, considered the need to have certainty. And the Attorney General, as the activist for implementing the civil side of the law, as the Attorney General does under our Constitution, approaches the court and asks for a listing of entities, designated entities, individuals, and entities. And in doing that, the Attorney General must satisfy a court, a high court, that there is a basis for doing that. Under the existing law, the unamended law, Section 25(3), Section 32, Section 33, all provide for the Attorney General to commence an investigation, because you can't go to court with no evidence. And the power of the Attorney General to commence this investigation and ask the FIU and have the FIU give you the information is in the existing law in Section 25.3, in Section 32, and Section 33. What we did in the bill, which the Joint Select Committee supported, was to say that the Commissioner of Police may give the Attorney General information, relevant information, for the purposes of the High Court, not on a frolic of his own. And that was brought about by way of the actual implementation of the law. Because upon coming into office as Attorney General, I can tell you, the anti-terrorism law stood without being touched. It was virgin law. Notwithstanding the fact that it stood there for 10 full years, it had not been implemented. But I am pleased to say, as Attorney General, I have had the privilege of having 350 listings in one end of the law, 6 listings under another end of the law, and 1 listing on another end of the law, in total comprising 357 listings, which has come in for commendation by the Financial Action Task Force and all of our international partners for taking the law into operation. I will speak, because it's obviously not enough time, to the successes we have had and the cautions. But let me put it this way as I come quickly to the end. This law is a requirement which commenced on our international platform and local platform. This law was put into motion in the year 1995, passing through 2005, 2010, 2011, 12, 14, 15. This law is law which is required to avoid 190 countries which comprise the Financial Action Task Force. It is designed to make sure we are not blacklisted by them, because in fact we have been mischaracterized already. It is essential that this is passed. It has been through wide public consultation, and I urge honorable senators to recognize this is the last day we can do this, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Anti-Terrorism Act, Chapter 1207, be now read a second time. Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me the opportunity to join this very important debate regarding a very sensitive piece of legislation in terms of the passage in this Honorable House. And Madam President, this legislation would have been introduced to Trinidad and Tobago in 2005, as correctly stated by the Attorney General. And over the years, there were 4 various amendments made to this legislation by Act 2 of 2010, Act 16 of 2011, Act 14 of 2012, and Act 15 of 2014. And Madam President, the reason I listed all of these amendments to this piece of law is simply to show that the evolution and the technologies and the advances in terrorism has been changing rapidly over the years. And as a country who is committed to fight terrorism, we must also have our laws being in tandem with the technology and the advances by terrorists in order to combat the activities in Trinidad and Tobago and worldwide. And Madam President, this bill has very draconian powers being entrusted onto law enforcement and to the executive arm of the state. And that is why this bill would have had to been referred to a Joint Select Committee, so that they would have had extensive consultation and enough deliberation in order to deal with all of the provisions in this piece of legislation. So there were 12 meetings and 3 sittings of the House of Representatives that dealt with all of the amendments that were made in the JSC and also further amendments that was proposed by the Leader of the Opposition just a few days ago in the other place. And Madam President, I was going to deal with this part of my presentation later on in the debate, in my contribution, but I would deal with it now. And the Attorney General would have indicated that the legislation, 1, does not give him extra powers. And two, there's the function of the Attorney General with respect to civil matters on behalf of the state and the Director of Public Prosecutions with regards to criminal matters of the state. And Madam President, if we look at all of the amendments, 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2014, those powers that were given to the Attorney General and law enforcement officers, they did not run afoul of any constitutional provisions or doctrines that we have. But the leader of the opposition, in her wisdom, would have identified at clauses 27, clauses 28, and clauses 34 that there were issues with regards to the Attorney General now having the power to receive a police investigation from the Commissioner of Police. It was the view of the leader of the opposition that this would run afoul of the doctrine of separation of powers, as no Attorney General, the present Attorney General, any future Attorney General shall have the power to receive any police investigation. And that is why those amendments were further proposed at the committee stage of the other place. And Madam President, the Attorney General is right that there's a separation of functions with regards to the AG and the Director of Public Prosecutions. So when it is said that the opposition leader backed down in one of the newspapers, that is fake news, Madam President. The leader of the opposition stood her ground until the additional powers of the Attorney General was removed, and that is the bill that is brought before this House. Because this is a hybrid situation, Madam President, where it's dealing with the civil side of the law and also the criminal side of the law. And this goes directly to Section 22B of the legislation, where the Attorney General has the power to list any individual or an entity as a terrorist and then freeze the assets of that person. So the Attorney General said that the powers existed. Yes, it did, but it did not exist that he would have in his possession a police investigation. Now, there are other pieces of legislation where the Director of Public Prosecutions can actually make these civil type applications. They are found in the Proceeds of Crime Act. They are also found in the Dangerous Drugs Act, Madam President. So it is incorrect to state that the DPP does not have these powers. But the opposition leader ensured that those additional powers were removed from the Attorney General, and that is why the opposition in the other place would have supported this piece of legislation. So I just want to put that on public record, that no one backed down, but that the leader of the opposition was able to attain what she had proposed in her amendments, Madam President. So as I move on, that the opposition signaling its support for this legislation in the other place shows our commitment to the fight against terrorism worldwide and in Trinidad and Tobago. Because we must remember that Trinidad and Tobago, being a twin island state and a dot on the map, is not immune from terrorism. We must remember the incidents of the 1990 attempted coup. We must remember in 2005 there was a bomb blast in Port of Spain. Quite recently, there was a Carnival terror threat, and many persons may have disputed whether or not this was a legitimate threat or whether it was an actual threat. Because we have seen from The Guardian an article dated the 14th of June 2018 by Gail Alexander, Jordanians tortured me.
Hussein, I've been following what you're saying. You're now veering off a little bit, all right? What you're going to refer to is not really relevant to what we are dealing with, okay?
I'm guided, Madam President. Madam President, I'm saying this to indicate that there's need for the legislation, that there's need for the advancement and the constant amendments of this type of law. Because when you look at what happened, it shows that we must ensure that when we are giving law enforcement these powers under this legislation, that they are able to properly monitor, investigate, and prosecute the offenses that are being created by this bill, Madam President. And interestingly enough, I saw an article from Al Jazeera where there was, the article, it says that Egypt's top appeals court overturns terrorist list ruling on Morsi. And Madam President, that is cause for concern. And I say this because we must be careful when the Attorney General exercises powers under this legislation to list any individual as a terrorist in Trinidad and Tobago. Because once you are branded in this manner, Madam President, the world sees you as a terrorist. Your assets are frozen, and you are no longer able to operate as an individual in Trinidad or even in any other country. And Madam President, imagine this, 1,500 persons who were listed under similar type provisions in Egypt. That list was overturned by the appeal court in Egypt. So I'm saying that these are causes for concern, that when the implementation of this legislation is put into force, that the law enforcement agencies do their due diligence and that we ensure that no person in Trinidad and Tobago is unfairly labeled as a terrorist. And that is the balancing exercise that we need to do in this legislation, Madam President, because on one hand, we are giving the law enforcement draconian powers, but on the other hand, we have to balance the rights and privileges and protections of our citizens' rights in Trinidad and Tobago. But I also want to make this comment early on. It is whether or not it is the commitment of this government for the fight against terrorism, or is it that this bill was brought simply because the government has to comply with its FATF recommendations, Madam President? Because we must be serious if we want to deal with terrorism. So I'm asking whether or not, had it not been for our compliance with FATF in September, whether or not this type of legislation would have seen the light of day in this honorable Parliament. And as a member of the JSC, Madam President, I think it's incumbent on me to state what would have taken place at that Joint Select Committee and the changes that would have been brought to the legislation. Because if you compare the bill that was laid in the Honorable House to what has been produced by the Joint Select Committee, there were remarkable changes. We sat, we listened to the stakeholders, we considered the bill clause by clause, and we understood the concerns, and we had to make certain changes and amendments to certain provisions in order to satisfy or heed the concerns of certain stakeholders, but also bearing in mind the FATF obligations that the country has to follow. And the Attorney General was right in the first instance. When you open the bill, you would have seen it flavored with Arabic names, and the Muslim stakeholders did indicate that they would have felt targeted by the fact that these Arabic names were used. The committee as a whole decided that we will remove all references to Arabic names. Inadvertently, the word Taliban remained, and that was removed at the committee stage of the House of Representatives. Then we looked at widening the definition of weapon. And this is a very important amendment, Madam President. And this was one that was brought to our attention by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Because when you look at the types of terrorist acts that are taking place in the world today, they're using very unconventional types of weapons. They're using vehicles to run over crowds. They're using fertilizers and nails to create explosives, Madam President. So therefore, the definition that was there before with regards to weapons was too restricted in order to properly deal with the advances in terrorism. So the definition from the Prevention of Crime Offences Weapon Act was used to define what a weapon is. Now, the Attorney General also would have mentioned that there's a changing of the mens rea, and this goes directly to the point of terrorist financing. Before, a criminal offense has two elements. There's the mens rea, there's the actus reus. The mens rea deals with the mental element, whereas the actus reus deals with the physical action in order to commit the crime, for the commission of the offense. Before, the mental element was that of recklessness. And with the element of recklessness, all a person who wants to fund any organization has to do is accept a risk that they are funding an organization affiliated with terrorism. And we found, and the Muslim stakeholders would have indicated, that this threshold was too low because certain persons in Trinidad and Tobago normally send their zakat, which is a 2.5% contribution from our income that we make towards the poor and needy. And they would have sent this zakat abroad. And they said that they felt that they can be caught very easily under this provision. So therefore, the mental element was raised to intention, so that you must intend to actually fund a terrorist organization, because we needed to protect our innocent brothers and sisters who legitimately send their zakat for legitimate reasons. Madam President, with respect to the declaration of geographical areas, again, it was found that one of the tenets of Islam, one of the pillars of Islam, is that of Hajj. And this is a pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Makkah. And then you visit Medina. And Madam President, the stakeholders would have indicated that certain areas that may be declared would be Middle Eastern countries. And we understood that there are certain areas that they will pass through in order to get to the Holy Land of Makkah, because there are no direct flights from Trinidad to Saudi Arabia. And what we did is that I asked one of the Maulana, that's Maulana Shiraz Ali, who appeared before the committee, how many persons will be affected? He said over 300 persons would travel for Hajj every year. He said there are 4 operators, there are about 25 to 30 persons studying abroad, and there are about 300 persons who perform the Umrah. This is the same pilgrimage outside of the Hajj period. And this period is coming up very shortly, in about 2 months. And when an area is declared, if a person fails to file his notice, Madam President, he is being presumed as a foreign terrorist fighter. So we understood that some persons may be affected by this. So therefore, the notice period was now extended, so that before you travel, you have the opportunity to give the notice. If you are abroad and an area is declared, then when you return, you have a 30-day window in order to file your notice, so that that presumption would be rebutted. And what the leader of the opposition, in her wisdom, also did is that she asked that this provision, this order being made by the Minister of National Security, be subject to negative resolution of the House of Representatives. And what this allows, Madam President, is to ensure that there is parliamentary scrutiny with respect to declaring geographical areas, because this affects our foreign affairs and the way in which our citizens would be affected worldwide. And these principles, Madam President, are very, very draconian in nature. And this was drafted through the after the Australian legislation, that we have now sought, before I forget, I would have made further submissions with regards to this area of the law in terms of Section 15B being amended. And that when the minister made an order, that order before would have lasted until whenever. So I suggested that there must be an anniversary date in which this order must lapse. And the committee did agree that we should put a 3-year time limit for this declaration to operate. So therefore, that the minister, before the 3 years is expired, will now have the power in order to renew the declaration, or before that 3 years in order to revoke the declaration. And Madam President, these were some of the significant changes that were made at the committee stage of the House of Representatives, at the Joint Select Committee. And I went through all of these to show that if the government really wants to pass good law, they should utilize the Joint Select Committees a bit more, so that we have wide stakeholder consultation, that we have contributions from both the independent and the opposition bench in order to strengthen and make better laws, Madam President. Now, I would like to move on and go on to some of the amendments that were made any other place that would have been brought to this House, because we must consider all of the amendments. And the Leader of the Opposition, at clause 36 of the bill, Madam President, if I may read the original clause 36 just to put it into context. Clause 36 states that it's clause 26. Clause 26. It deleted the old subsection D, and it now reads that for the purposes of section 22B, the FIU shall be responsible for furnishing the Attorney General with information required to facilitate an application under section 22B and section 37 spontaneously or upon request. Now, Madam President, what does this do? This gave the Attorney General the power to now request from the FIU any person's financial information. Previously, the law as it stood would have indicated that the FIU, based on its own volition, will give the Attorney General information on whom? Designated entities. Who are designated entities? Terrorist organizations. Now, this would have given the Attorney General powers to get any person, Madam President, terrorist or not, financial information. The Leader of the Opposition stood very strong on this point, and the Attorney General subsequently removed it, and therefore the old law now stands. Now, there was the addition on the proposed amendments of a new clause 46, which was subsequently included in another clause, which dealt with, because there are extensive powers being exercised by the executive and law enforcement, that an annual report be laid by the Minister of National Security in the Parliament to indicate the amount of prosecutions and the amount of areas that are listed as designated entities. So therefore, that there will be some check and balance on the exercise of these extremely draconian powers that are present in this piece of legislation. And the reason why all of these were included, Madam President, is to show that there must be a level of accountability and transparency when exercising these powers. Because there are other jurisdictions, such as Australia, the UK, where there are independent reviewers that will look at the powers being exercised by these bodies. But this is absent in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a police complaints authority. We have the unit within the police service. But, Madam President, we have all heard of the inefficiencies of them to properly deal with complaints regarding the exercise of excessive police powers, that persons have to resort to the court for redress. And, Madam President, I would like to now deal with whether or not this bill would in fact help with our fight against terrorism. Now, I would have attended a training program, and one of the last stakeholders that we met with was a group, the Muslims Public Affairs Council in Los Angeles. And the presenter there put it in context. He was indicating that this issue of radicalization and this issue of when a person wants to present himself as an extremist, that this is really a mental health issue. And this bill, Madam President, deals with the symptoms of this. It doesn't address the root causes and the concerns with regards to a person who wants to be radicalized or become a terrorist. And there's something called countering violent extremism. And countering violent extremism, Madam President, these are the social factors and conditions that operate in order for a person to become a terrorist. And I would really appreciate if, Madam President, you will give me the leeway just in order to just go through in a very short space of time with regards to how we should really deal with our citizens of Trinidad and Tobago leaving. Because what we are doing, Madam President, is we are not treating with the problem. What we are actually doing is that we are criminalizing a mental health issue, which is incorrect. It's not the correct approach that we take. Because there are 5 buckets in order to look at CVE. They are preventative, it's intervention, it's rehabilitation, it's reintegration, and research. we have not heard from the government with regards to what they are going to do to prevent terrorism. What measures they are going to take to intervene in terrorism. What are the rehabilitation programs for persons who are expressing these extremist tendencies? What is the reintegration model that is going to be adopted for foreign terrorist fighters or persons who are deemed to be terrorists? What is the research that is being conducted? Because when we heard that Trinidad and Tobago has the highest per capita recruit of ISIS members, that did not come from any department in Trinidad and Tobago. That was stated in a United States of America Department of State report. So therefore, we must understand the context in which we are giving law enforcement these powers. Because you have to deal with the procedures and you have to deal with the system that is currently in place and whether or not they are capable enough to enforce the legislation. And these are the drivers, Madam President, because a person who wants to become a terrorist, he becomes a terrorist because there's a loss of opportunity. Because what is being presented to him? Because in Trinidad and Tobago currently, there are no jobs for him. But when ISIS is promising that they will pay them a per diem, they are going towards that, Madam President. So we must deal with the root causes of terrorism in Trinidad and Tobago. While I understand the need that we must criminalize terrorists, we must also prevent our young people from becoming radicals. Madam President, may I ask how much time I have again? 12 minutes? Okay. No, I would like to. And Madam President,
You can take extra time. Football.
Madam President, the Attorney General would have made certain comments with regards to terrorists are not Muslims, and I want to endorse that comment. Because before the Joint Select Committee, Muslim stakeholders appeared. And if these persons feel as though they would be targeted, I think it is incumbent on every arm of government to listen to their concerns. And we must say together that this legislation should not be passed in any House of Parliament in order to target any specific groups. Because when you look at the historical imbalance that Muslims face worldwide, Madam President, their concern has merit in it. Because when most of them fly abroad, or most of them in Trinidad and Tobago, with respect to the recent terrorist threat in the Carnival period, 13 Muslims were in fact arrested, and 13 Muslims were in fact released without charge. So we must deal with the realities of the situation. And it hurts my heart as being a Muslim to hear that persons of my religion are using Islam in the name of propaganda. Because Islam means peace, Madam President. Islam, the Arabic word, and the English translation is peace. And therefore, persons who are using Islam for convenient reasons and for rank, Madam President, that is not the tenets of the religion. And when some persons say that the reason that they become radicalized is because of a jihad, we must understand what the word jihad means. Jihad means battle. And it's, first of all, an internal battle. So most of these persons who are propagating Islam and saying that they need to go to Syria or Iraq to fight in the name of Islam, they must get up and pray their 5 daily salah first before they leave on a plane to fight for some other country. And Madam President, all of these are concerns that we must take into account. The government must be fully aware of what the religion of Islam is. That our law enforcement must also be kept up to date and relevant with respect to what Islam is, because it was a complete joke when a police officer went on national television to wish the Muslim community Happy Diwali. Yeah, because also when we met with the Sheriff's Department in Los Angeles, that Sheriff's Department, Madam President, actually has a class for persons or the Sheriff County that they are trained in they have cultural classes so that they go and they understand what different cultures and religion really mean. And let me get back to the bill, Madam President, because I know that I stray a bit. And one of the concerns that the Islamic community would have raised is that of the corporate the corporate criminality. Madam President, the reason I straight is because I'm very passionate about this, because my name is Saddam Hussein, right? I am a Muslim, but I have never been subjected to any terrorist activities, Madam President,
Senator,
or I will never become a terrorist.
Senator Hussein, I have not called on you. I have not said that you are straying. You issued that confession yourself. I think you have expressed your passion. It is understood, and I would ask you now to get back to the
Yes, Madam President, and I'm guided. And one of the concerns with regards to the corporate criminality that the bill presents, Madam President, is that what is new in the legislation that was not there before is to include companies who may be, in fact, be involved in funding of terrorism. And when we looked at the legislation initially, what it did is that if a director, for example, myself and let's say Senator Amin are directors of that company, and one of us become involved in the or are convicted of an offense with regards to terrorist financing, then it has the ability to shut down the entire company, whether or not that company is involved with respect to terrorism or not. And we must look at the fine. Corporate criminality goes up to $30 million, revocation of the business license, also winding up of the company assets, seizing the assets of the company into the seized funds, the seized assets funds. And these provisions, Madam President, are very draconian. So what the protection that was given into the legislation or implanted there is that the director must now be using the company as a vehicle or using the company to benefit from financing of terrorist acts. And this in itself, Madam President, presents a protection for members who are willing to give their zakat or any contribution abroad, Madam President. And that point with regard to declaring a geographical zone, it appears, and in the legislation, it operates as a protection. And I say it's a protection because, one, the minister has to be satisfied that there's a terrorist organization engaging in terrorist acts in any foreign country. Now, the Attorney General did not mention it, but the government or the state cannot declare an entire country to be a terrorist zone. So therefore, only part of that country would be declared. And as a reasonable citizen, if I know that that area is being declared as a terrorist zone, now it protects me because I would not want to travel there because it's for my own safety that I would not want to travel there. And it now operates as a filter exercise because those who travel for a legitimate purpose would now be caught under this because, would be absolved under this. And those who travel for illegitimate purpose will be caught because those who travel without issuing the notice, automatically it would raise a red flag as to the reason for their travel and not filing the notice. So it actually gives an opportunity for a person to be absolved from any presumption of being a foreign terrorist fighter, Madam President. One other issue that the Muslim community would have also expressed is that of the powers being taken away from the police sergeants and that giving it to any police officer. That now there was a provision that dealt with, that is with respect to section 38A, which dealt with removing police officer above the rank of sergeant. And they felt that very junior officers, without the necessary training, would now have the ability to abuse the powers that are being given to them. And these are very serious concerns. But I know the Attorney General at the committee stage would have indicated that there were issues with regards to properly prosecuting offenses under the anti-gang legislation. I don't know, maybe any winding up the Attorney General can just clarify that point with regards to the removal of the police officers with respect to the rank of sergeant. Now, there's one other section that is in clause 9 that deals with an offense of collecting, Madam President. So a person who collects material for a terrorist act may in fact will now be criminalized. And there was a concern that persons who would collect materials such as fertilizers may well find themselves running afoul of the law. Persons who may collect material with regards to various ideologies may regard themselves running afoul of the law. But it is so circumscribed in the legislation, Madam President, is that the person must intend, so that you collect with the intention of committing a terrorist act. Now, the police officers must ensure that they understand what this provision is. Just because I have numerous literatures on jihad or any other ideology, you cannot come and arrest me. There must be enough evidence or enough monitoring in order for them to make out a proper charge that there's an intention to actually commit a terrorist act, Madam President. So Attorney General, I would have met with some of the Muslim brothers yesterday. They would have expressed some concerns with me with regards to the offense of collecting. Also, again, I ask that you address this in the winding up of the debate, because we have had extensive discussions at the JSC, both in camera and in public, with regards to this offense of collecting collecting material for the purpose of committing a terrorist act. And, Madam President, we also indicated in the legislation that many persons may not know about the declaration of geographical areas, and therefore there's a wide extension in terms of circulation with regards to the when an order is made, so that the public now becomes aware, so that they would not be so that they would not be unaware of where these areas are. And if you would allow me, these orders must be published in the Gazette once a week for at least 2 weeks in the daily newspapers, on the websites of National Security, Foreign Affairs, CARICOM, website of the Attorney General, all offices of National Security, Foreign Affairs, CARICOM Affairs, all offices of the AG, and every port of entry, and shall be forwarded to the Commissioner of Police. And I think this has merit in it, because normally no one reads the Gazette only. Mm-hmm. No one is really aware of what is being published in the Gazette unless you actually go out and look for it. So therefore, with this widespread publication, it would now allow persons to be aware of what is being done under the legislation with regard to the declaration of various geographical areas. And this is a very, very sensitive area, because persons believe that this would restrict their rights to travel. And we must ensure that they understand that it does not restrict their right to travel. You are allowed to travel in a geographical area. All that is required is that notice be given in order to travel to that
5 more minutes.
To travel in that geographical area. One issue with regards to the Joint Select Committee when we met with the FIU that I was very concerned about is when the director of the FIU indicated to the committee that there should be an offense where persons would have in fact celebrated certain terrorist activities, glorified the activities. And this is found in the UK legislation, Madam President. And as a responsible committee, we could not have considered that to form part of the bill before this House, because we must understand under our Constitution that we have the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech, Madam President. And to put that within the legislation, what it would actually do.
Hussein, you are actually, have a seat, you are actually now talking about something that is not in the bill. And therefore, you're straying from the relevance issue, okay? Yeah?
Madam President, this formed part of the committee's deliberation. And I understand the point on the bill, that it didn't form part of the bill, Madam President. But just to give, because this issue was widely publicized, so I just want, for the benefit of the public, so that they know that these offenses do not form part of the bill. Because
Senator Hussein, you have few minutes again. Just move on, please, and deal with what is in the bill as opposed to what is not in the bill, okay?
I oblige, Madam President. And Madam President, I go back to the point that at the end of the day, the opposition is very concerned about the fight against terrorism. We amended this legislation four different times, and on all 4 occasions, we did not enlarge the powers of the Attorney General to run afoul of any constitutional provisions. That when this bill was brought before the other place, our leader, our party stood strong in the opposition. We took a bipartisan approach, and that we must now correct the record that the opposition did not back down on this issue, but that we were able to accomplish what we proposed to be done, Madam President. Thank you.
Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And first, let me state my full support to the government for the legislation that is before us. I want to also thank members of the Joint Select Committee, members of the opposition government, and in particular, my two colleagues on the independent bench, Senator Choate and Senator Creese, who, when asked to serve, willingly served. And what has resulted to me is a bill which I find perhaps is the best that we could produce at this time. Madam President, I think we are all very much against terrorism. As the Honorable Attorney General indicated, it is old. For me, I know there are definitions here, but for me, conventional warfare is soldiers fighting soldiers. And terrorism, for me, is armed people fighting regular unarmed civilians. And I think the inequity of that fight is that which we find most disagreeable and reprehensible. And we must do what we can to put an end to this type of activity. I am also happy to see that all references to Muslim names have been removed from the bill. I saw earlier pieces of the bill, and I'm happy to see that these references have been removed. Because, Madam President, before I get to the concerns I have, while I give full support, I do have concerns, and I will indicate to the Attorney General immediately the concerns are with respect to Clause 8 and Clause 22. But before I go there, Madam President, the familiarity to me of terrorism started way back in 1971. And I mentioned the fact that I'm happy to see removal of Muslim names in the bill, because for me, terrorism was always a European phenomenon. In 1971, starting high school for the first time, there was a program on TTT, and I see TTT is coming back, and I hope they reintroduce it. It was called News Capsule in those days, from 5 o'clock to 5 minutes past 5. I don't know how many people remember News Capsule. And you looked at News Capsule, Madam President, because afterwards there was the Pink Panther, which is what one wanted to see, and I wanted to see that. But on News Capsule, every day in 1971, I'm hearing about a bombing in Belfast. And I said, Belfast has to be the most dangerous place in the world. And when they abated in Belfast, there were the Basque separatists, the Basque region in France and Spain, and they started to act up. The Basques then abated, and after the Basques, there was the Bader-Meinhof gang in Germany. And I said, Europe has to be a very dangerous place as a youngster. And I said, well, if I'm going to pursue graduate education, I want to avoid Europe, because it appears as though there is always some kind of activity going on there, only to realize that the city that I studied eventually, Montreal, had in 1970 major terrorist activity. The Front de Libération du Québec kidnapped people and murdered one of them, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau had to call out the National Guard, the father of current Prime Minister. So that terrorism for me was more a developed country phenomenon. And it has been around for quite a while, where you have armed people attacking unarmed civilians for a particular cause. And so I think we need to do what we can do to bring, hopefully, to minimize this particular activity. Madam President, the concerns I have refer to Clause 8. And in particular, Clause 8, sub 5, where, and if, with your leave, Madam President, I'd read, where a body corporate has been convicted of an offense under this section, the court shall have the power. We are giving the court a tremendous amount of power to revoke a business license, order that the body corporate be wound up, forfeit the assets, and so on. But, Madam President, and I know the Honorable Attorney General will address this in his winding up, my view is that the body corporate is made up of directors and managers headed by a chief executive officer, and the body corporate headed by these people may find that the people have engaged in activities which are in conflict with the public interest. So let us take, for example, a corporation which is involved in the field of weapons manufacture. Raytheon in the United States, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. I could very well see that the officers of these companies, who are supposed to sell their missiles and weapons to bona fide governments, deciding to increase earnings per share, trade with the enemy, trade with the terrorists. And there is, in Trinidad and Tobago, a law known as Trading with the Enemy Act. So these directors do it. But I ask myself, what does the corporation have to do with the actions of the directors or the senior managers? Don't we have laws already on our books which will deal with officers of corporations who are involved in wrongdoing? In the United States, there is Sarbanes-Oxley. Here we have a Securities and Exchange Commission. And there are laws governing the circumstances under which a body shall be wound up. Madam President, I am a little bit confused as to why the court shall have the power to order that the body corporate be wound up when it is officers in the corporation who have done wrong. And we have to understand that a corporation is made up of active officers and passive individuals, and individuals who are not in any way involved with the business. Who are these individuals who would be adversely affected if the court decides to wind up a body which has been involved in terrorist financing or supplying material to these terrorist groups? The shareholders. Shareholders have nothing to do with the day-to-day operations of a company. What is to happen to their shares if this company is known to engage in improper practices? We have bondholders. We have the regular employees, and we have the retirees. So, Madam President, I know the Attorney General probably has good reason for wanting to give the power to the court to order that the body corporate be wound up. But I'm simply wondering whether existing law, the existing corporate law, does not already address the issue of irresponsibility and illegality on the part of corporate officers, and why do we have to have that in the anti-terrorist legislation? So that is of concern to me, and I'm sure the Honorable Attorney General will address that. Madam President, my concern is also with Clause 22. In Clause 22, let's see, 22B, right. It says in Clause 22B1, the minister may, for the purposes of this section by order, subject to negative resolution of Parliament, designate a geographical area in a foreign country as a declared geographical area. And the declared geographical area is an area in which you really should not travel. This particular section infringes upon our constitutional right of freedom of movement. The section with respect to winding up a corporation will affect our constitutional rights to property, so that there are two rights here. which are being infringed upon. The first one, with respect to winding up a corporation, I don't know if it is necessary at all. But this second one, where I am being asked to agree to a restriction of movement, has me a bit concerned, because it says under 15b2, the minister shall, prior to making a designation under subsection 1, inform the leader of the opposition in writing of the proposed designation of that geographical area of the foreign country. And I simply ask myself, it is good and proper to inform the leader of the opposition, but how did the Minister of National Security come to the point where he has made a determination that a particular area is deemed a restricted area? Take, for example, the restricted area. He might say it's not a country according to the law. It's not going to be the United Kingdom, but it could be Northern Ireland, which is a component of the United Kingdom. And in Northern Ireland, you did have the problem with the Irish Republican Army, and so our minister could come to a determination that we should not travel there, even though citizens of Trinidad and Tobago may have very good reasons for being in Belfast. I would have loved to go there. For example, there is Queen's University in Belfast, one of the top 200 in the world. Trouble or no trouble, it's a fantastic academic institution, and you would have education, you have graduations, you could have people living there, and there could be good reason for Trinidadians being there. And if the minister is to make a designation that this area is restricted, I would like to know, how did he come to the point where he made this determination? And this is where I think the law is very silent. And I am hoping, Madam President, that in a review of this law, I am recommending, while we look at a designation area according to the law every 3 years, if the Minister of National Security says area X in the world is a restricted area, today, you know that 3 years from today, in 2021, the order would be lifted. I recommend that we also look at the legislation at the same time to determine if we need to change anything here based upon developments in the world of terror, in the global world of terror. So I leave that for the Honorable Attorney General and for future attorneys who would be in charge of looking at this particular law. But, Madam President, there is a recommendation. And the recommendation is, before the Minister of National Security makes that determination, because there is a restriction of our constitutional rights, freedom of movement, I refer to our standing orders. And I don't know why we have not included, based upon Standing Order 95, the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Commendations to the 10th Parliament for introducing a Committee on Foreign Affairs for the first time in our parliamentary system. I was the first chairman in 2010. I am a current member now of that committee. But what does the standing orders tell us about Standing Order 95? The Committee on Foreign Affairs shall have the duty of considering from time to time and reporting whenever necessary on all matters relating to the foreign policy of the government and examining the implications and likely effect on Trinidad and Tobago. So before a Minister of National Security makes a determination, I would imagine the instrument of Parliament should be utilized and should be employed so that members of Parliament, I understand the need to include the leader of the opposition, but that does not mean that the Senate of the Republic is also included. It certainly does not include representation from the independent bench, and the Committee on Foreign Affairs is charged with this responsibility. So I would recommend for the future, I did not table an amendment. I understand the necessity of passing this law. I understand the expediency. I understand the urgency, but I recommend that
in the future, we include the Committee on Foreign Affairs so that restrictions on freedom of movement can be deliberated upon by the members of this committee. And of course, the Minister of National Security is not duty-bound to accept the recommendations of the committee. However, the Parliament would be involved in a much more meaningful way. And therefore, given that the committee would have access to the Institute of International Relations at the university, foreign missions operating here, technical experts that we could obtain via teleconferencing, I have seen it done, it means that we would be able to advise the Minister of National Security on the implications, the likely effects, and whether he should proceed or not. So I think this is something that we should be looking at, and including, since our standing orders do in fact allow us now to utilize the committee system so that the laws we produce in the fight against terror can be a bit more focused. Madam President, the Honorable Attorney General mentioned a name. For the first time I heard it, a name, Shane Crawford. Well, I do not know, it's the first time I'm hearing the name, yet I've never heard the name Shane Crawford before. But I have not been reading too much in the literature. However, I would like to mention another name, and that is, apparently Shane Crawford has brought the country into great disrepute. There is another name, his name is Ravi Ramratan. Ravi Ramratan, and while I looked at this particular bill, I said to myself, this is an interesting name too, because Ravi Ramratan, and this is all in the fight against terror, was our presidential gold medalist in 2002. This was a young man who went to Presentation College Chaguanas like me, went and studied economics like me, was from Cunupia like me, and I understand he was even going to pursue postgraduate education at McGill University like me. I never met the fella. But what happened because of terrorism is that the pride of Trinidad and Tobago, the prize of Trinidad and Tobago, and national scholarship winners don't normally read economics. They read engineering and law and medicine. This was one person who was committing his life and his intellect to the eradication of poverty. And at the Westgate Mall in Kenya in 2013, together with 67 other people, this young man was killed by terrorists. What is interesting about that is this. This young man would have contributed more to the cause and the welfare and the plight of the terrorists than they would have known. And so, Madam President, the fight against terrorism is close to Trinidad too. We cannot have our best and the brightest being decimated like that. All the sympathies to the family of this young man, to the economics profession. I would have liked to meet this man. I never will. But you know, when I look at his fight against poverty in Africa, I said to myself, maybe we should have more dialogue with the terrorists. Let us find out. Because Ravi Ramratan, right now he would have had a PhD. I am sure he would have been able to solve, Madam President, many of the problems that the terrorists were fighting for. I think we must move, as Senator Saddam Hussein indicated, away from the law and into policy, which is reacting, and into policy where we need to tell the terrorists, what you are doing is bad for us, but by destroying people who can help you, what you are doing is worse for you. And I think if we can move from law towards dialogue and policy, let us find out what is ailing the terrorists. I would like to talk to Mr. Shane Crawford. Find out, why did you leave Trinidad? And what am I doing wrong? And once I know what I am doing wrong, if he can tell me what I am doing wrong, I know, well, maybe you will not have an incentive to go and engage in the kinds of actions which will cause destruction to the people of Trinidad and Tobago and ultimately destruction to you. Madam President, I support the law. I commend the law. And while, in fact, Madam President, I am very liberal with respect to rights and very parsimonious with respect to using the country's money, on this occasion, I support the government as it tries to restrict rights because the greater good is at stake. Thank you very much.
Senator De Freitas.
Thank you, Madam President. I am thankful for the opportunity to contribute to the bill that is before us, which is an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act, Chapter 1207. Madam President, I think it has been said so far by all contributors that have gone before me that terrorism is a global issue that needs to be dealt with. And I think, by virtue of the statement said before, each and every person, regardless of age, regardless of where they are in their lives, would have either through media or experiences, depending on where they're from, encountered or engaged terrorist activity. So when you speak to terrorism, each and every person knows exactly what you're talking about. And I remember thinking back where, in my adult life, my first encounter with what terrorism is and the impact that it can have would have been at university. And I remember coming into the university center that morning and noticing something being wrong because you saw individuals who would normally be hustling and bustling towards class at a standstill, focused on a television that was on a news station in that university center. And after we realized what was going on, there was an emotional response by almost everybody. And just to let all those listening know, this would have been in Canada, so you understand where, and I'm talking about that terrorist act of 9/11, as much as it would have happened in New York, there was still an emotional impact that far away because we would have been asking ourselves, well, what is next? Is it going to be World War III? Is that going to happen? Are we, as young people at that point in time, going to experience World War III? And so, Madam President, we got to understand that terrorism, or the act of terrorism, is something that for one reason or the other has plagued the planet, and we've heard that today already. Its prevalence, in my humble view, seems to be rising. And I'm not sure if it's due to the world, as we know it, shrinking by way of technology in the sense that one person on one side of the planet can engage in conversation with another person on the other side of the planet quite easily. And in so doing, you have a free-flowing of ideologies, for better or for worse. And all of this ensures that the act of terrorism is actually a beast that is not easily tamed, or, quite frankly, a crippling disease that is not easily cured. And as a matter of fact, it reminds me of a deadly bacteria, which as soon as you come up with a medicine to fight it, it mutates and adapts, and you have to adapt with it in order to keep ahead of it. And I say that to say, Madam President, that with the Joint Select Committee that was set up, that is what we had done. And that is what we are doing here today by way of amendments to the Parent Act. And as the Attorney General put forward, we would have gone through those rounds of mutual assessment, and the areas where we are weak in terms of our Terrorism Act would have been identified, and therefore we are putting these amendments forward to ensure that we strengthen it as part of an international community that is trying to fight terrorism on a global level. So, Madam President, on that Joint Select Committee, I'm not a lawyer, and so I would not have gone into the Joint Select Committee with a prescriptive attempt to look at the clauses before us. What I would have done was I would have taken the layman's perspective. And in that layman's perspective, I would have identified an underlying principle with which I approach this bill. And that is, everyone is not a terrorist, but anyone can be a terrorist. And with that approach taken to the bill, you're trying to do two things. You're trying to strengthen the bill that is before us in relation to the international community and the recommendations that were put forward. But at the same time, you're trying to protect the citizens of the country, especially the ones that may be caught up with the bill that is before us. Because as you put forward the bill and the amendments, you may end up with what you call a broad brushing. And in that broad brushing, you would have citizens being caught up, and you don't want that. So you want to ensure that there are provisions put in place so that you treat with that, so that individuals who are caught up innocently are not affected. So, Madam President, how do you go about doing that? You liaise with international entities. The Attorney General has spoken to that. You consult at home with agencies that are one way or the other would be engaged in this type of terrorist activity and its prevention. You consult with the public and those that may be most affected. And that is what we did on this Joint Select Committee. We had public meetings as well as invited comments from the public and religious organizations. We invited comments from the TTPS, the Law Association, the Financial Intelligence Unit, all of whom responded, and we had robust discussion which would have produced what is in front of us today. So at this point in time, I just wish to take this opportunity, if it has not been done before, to commend all of those individuals and all of those entities that would have taken part in this process to bring what is before us and to strengthen our legislation as it relates to anti-terrorism. So, Madam President, all of the speakers that have gone before me have gone through quite extensively in relation to the clauses within the bill and have spoken to what has happened at the Joint Select Committee. So I do not want to take too long to repeat that, lest I, again, breach the standing order in relation to tedious repetition. So what I will try to do is just address some of the issues that have come up in relation to that balancing act that has been put forward by way of strengthening the legislation and protecting citizens. Now, the legislation before us tries to strengthen our anti-terrorism initiatives by way of criminalizing or creating offenses in relation to soliciting, pre-planning, planning, execution, financing, coercing, and harboring anything in relation to or associated to terrorist activity. We try also to protect citizens by way of taking into account religious practice that may have certain groups run afoul of this legislation, industrial practice that may also have certain groups run afoul of this legislation, but more importantly, just individuals who, through regular activities, unknowingly run afoul of the legislation. So, Madam President, Senator Mahabir, Senator Hussain, and the Attorney General in their contributions would have spoken to what was done in relation to the names of particular errant Muslim groups, what was done in relation to that, to the particular clause in the definitions, to remove that so that groups, or particularly Muslim groups, do not feel as though they are being unfairly targeted. So what I want to do at this point in time is to just point out particular areas of the bill that strengthening would have taken place, that has not been spoken to in any kind of specific way. And the first is with Clause 5A, where you introduce the definition of bearer negotiable instruments, meaning travelers' checks, etc., and money orders. And I say this to say this is strengthening because when you're dealing with terrorism and the adaptability of terrorism, because these individuals that engage in these types of activity are hell-bent on executing a particular plan. And in doing so, they would change their modus operandi and change their methodology. And one of the ways that you would go about financing that is that they would use, whether it be money or cash, whether it be any instrument, to gain an upper hand in terms of getting what they need to get to execute that terrorist activity. So therefore, when it is you implement into the legislation things like bearer negotiable instruments and definitions for cash, definitions for property, what you do is you strengthen the legislation by taking into account all of these avenues by which individuals can engage in financing of terrorist activity. But one of the most important sections that was beefed up in terms of definition is Clause 5C, and that is the word terrorist. And the words an individual was added to this section. And I say that to say it's important because if you go back to most terrorist activities, especially the ones that are prominent globally, example 9/11, it's always attached to some group. And by putting in this legislation the words an individual, you take into account the fact, as I said, where the planet and the globe is getting smaller by way of technology, that ideologies can now go as far as across the planet, so much so that an individual in another country can pick up on an ideology but not be a member of any of those groups and still try to execute a terrorist activity. And therefore, That is why I'm saying the legislation is strengthened by adding the words "an individual" throughout the legislation to take into account that fact. So, Madam President, I move on to Clause 5F, where it's speaking to the strengthening of the definition of the word weapon. And Senator Hussain would have spoken to this because this would have been done at the committee stage. And I just want to go into that a little bit more and to say that as much as we would have added that definition of weapon in the legislation, we are seeing now where, again, terrorist groups or terrorists or individuals who engage in terrorist activity are trying to find different modus operandi to execute their plan. And Senator Hussain spoke to vehicles, and that came from a sentiment where we are seeing, and I think it was in the last 6 months in the UK and in other places where individuals are using vehicles to plow into crowds, seemingly. And when you look at it from that standpoint, you would not think naturally when a vehicle runs into a crowd that is a terrorist activity or it has anything to do with terrorism. You may naturally think that maybe the brakes were bad or the individual was drunk or something to that effect happened. But we are seeing now where that is becoming more prevalent. And I just want to refer to a website that I found because I went to look for the particular incident that occurred. And what came up was the website for the Hansard recorders, edition.cnn.com. And the title of that website is Terrorist Attacks by Vehicle Fast Facts. And what we're looking at is that this would have been occurring since 2006. And it goes all the way to 2017. And in 2017, there would have been 7 separate incidents where individuals would have used vehicles to plow into crowds specifically for terrorist activity. So I'm saying, Madam President, that the definition that we've put into the bill in relation to weapons, where you expand to cover any article that could be used in such a manner, is strengthening this legislation. So, Madam President, I identified those particular clauses to see how we strengthen the bill. The Attorney General would have spoken to international agencies, the Financial Action Task Force, identifying recommendations, so I will not go too much further in relation to that because they would have identified the recommendations, they would have permeated this bill to strengthen this legislation and bring us up to a level and a standard in keeping with the other 190 countries in the global community so that there's a global attempt to fight terrorism. What I want to deal with now is the idea of protecting citizens and addressing some of the issues that would have been put up. Now, on the Joint Select Committee, I would have heard Senator Hussain speak to, and in the other place when the debate was there and the committee stage, the idea of the Attorney General or a Attorney General having too much powers. And when I first heard it, and as I was listening, and I'm listening here, I found it hard to understand why this was not raised at the Joint Select Committee level. And I say this for a reason. Because at that level, we had discussions in relation to the powers of an Attorney General, whereby the Attorney General would have to list entities. And what was raised was the abuse of that power to list an individual or list an entity, and therefore create stress or a problem for that entity, especially if there was an abuse of that power. And in that conversation, we would have indicated that there would have been a judicial process put into the legislation whereby if an entity or an individual is to be listed, that there would be required a judicial process or an order to be brought in front of a judge and evidence to be brought before you can list that entity or that individual. And I'm saying that to say, Madam President, that if we went through this at the Joint Select Committee, clause by clause, and the issue of the powers of the Attorney General was raised at that point, so much so that we dealt with it by way of a judicial process and the listing of entities, why was it not raised at that point in time in relation to the powers and receiving information for the Financial Intelligence Unit? And I will tell you why. Because that was not the problem then. And you have to remember, Madam President, that we had entities come before us in public meetings of which the Financial Intelligence Unit would have been a part. They did not raise it at that point in time. But this was only raised after the Joint Select Committee process on the floor of the Parliament. Now, we have an opposition who time and time again on most legislation that comes to this parliament indicates that they want bills to go to a joint select committee because it's a more robust process. You can take your time, you can bring entities in front of you, you can engage in consultation, you can go through clause by clause, you can deal with it, and it just makes for a better parliamentary process. So I have to ask the question, if we went through clause by clause at the joint select committee level, if it is that the issue of the powers of the Attorney General was raised, why was it not raised by the opposition then? And I say this to say, Madam President, I say this to say that when it came to the floor, the general purpose of what they did was to obstruct the process that has to happen here. And I will say this, Madam President, there's a psychological methodology that speaks to you see in others that which exists in yourself. And here we see the opposition speaking to abuse of powers by an Attorney General. Which entity, which government is the only government in Trinidad and Tobago that has an Attorney General fired and accused of criminal activity?
Madam President, 46-1, please.
Senator De Freitas, can you get back to the bill, please?
Thank you, Madam President. So, Madam President, I'm saying that to say that when you speak to the powers of the Attorney General, as the opposition has put forward, and that is such a problem, what I want this population to understand is that opposition members were trying to, or fully well willing to not support the bill at that particular point in time.
Madam
which
President,
there wasn't
46-6, please, the member is imputing improper motives.
Senator De Freitas, you are infringing the standing order, so I would ask you to make your presentation in a different way, please.
Sure. So, Madam President, thank you for, and I'm so guided. So, Madam President, I won't say that they would have not supported the bill. I would say that it was, they did, they're absolutely right. The bill was eventually supported after an about term. What I was saying is that the reason that that would have been put forward and the reason for that particular clause in the bill causing an issue was because of what they are saying by way of a Attorney General abusing their power. And I'm saying that if you're dealing with anti-terrorism, and if that is the focus, and if it is you're trying to raise the standards of your anti-terrorism bill locally to meet the standards of the international community, then that is not something that you would think about. And I just want to reiterate that point, that it's only thought about because it happened under their tenure where an Attorney General would have gone down a particular route. So, Madam President, not to take too long on this, I think that it has been put forward. We have the issue of the Attorney General dealing with the listed entities. We have the issue of protecting individuals.
Members, please allow the Senator to make his presentation.
Thank you, Madam President. So we're speaking to the Attorney General and the powers he has by way of listed entities, and also the powers of the Minister by way of designated geographical areas. And I'm responding to issues raised by members opposite in relation to that particular issue. And what I'm saying, Madam President, is that things would have been put into the bill to ensure that citizens are protected. So you understand that whereby you are entering a designated geographical area where that has been put forward by order prior to your leaving Trinidad and Tobago, there is a process by which you can notify the Commissioner of Police, and therefore you are not found to be in contravention of the law. But there's also that issue that has been identified whereby upon traveling, the order can be put forward where a designated geographical area comes into play while you're en route. And there's also provisions put in, as Senator Hussain rightly indicated, whereby upon returning to the country, you have 30 days by which you can put forward that notification that you have been to that area and therefore not be in contravention of the law. We've also put into the bill in relation to notifications and expanding from the Gazette to the weekly papers to the ports of entry to ensure that individuals will have every opportunity to know when they have been in contravention of the law by traveling to a designated geographical area. In relation to the listed entities, provisions have been put in place, and I indicated in relation to judicial process, whereby if you are going to list an individual or an entity, you have to go to a judge and have that order and state your case as to why you're doing that. Again, Madam President, it goes even further to say that if it is you are listed as an individual or entity and you have a problem with that listing, that you are able to, after or within 60 days, apply to the judge to be heard as to why you should not be listed, and then you go through that process again, whereby the attorney or a attorney general would have to state their case in front of that individual and in front of the judge, and the judge has the power to remove that individual from the listed entity. And I say these things, Madam President, to say that the Balancing Act, by way of strengthening the legislation as it relates to the international standards that we have to meet, and the fact that you want to protect citizens who may find themselves in contravention of this law, was done at the Joint Select Committee level. I do not think that the Attorney General would have abused, or any Attorney General would have abused that power. That really comes from the mind of individuals who would have had to engage that particular process when they were in power. And therefore, what has been put forward should be done so that we can meet the standards of the international community, so that we are not blacklisted, and that we can move forward and strengthen the link and the community, the global community that is being put forward to deal with terrorism. Madam President, with those few words, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank you for this opportunity to contribute in today's debate. The Act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act has received a lot of attention in Trinidad and Tobago. And certainly I think it's a good sign when members of the opposition, members of the government, and stakeholders could put their views together in this democracy that is Trinidad and Tobago, a democracy that is protected by the institution of Parliament, to bring forward good law for the sake of everyone. I say that because I was particularly interested in hearing members of the Joint Select Committee today, in today's debate, because the Parliament allows a process for members of the Joint Select Committee from various benches to have a say in consultation with stakeholders. That is the only time many people who are not parliamentarians get to have a say and get to have an input in what becomes law in Trinidad and Tobago. The members of the Joint Select Committee may come from different political parties, but every elected member of the Lower House of Representatives has a duty to speak on behalf of their constituents. And so when I heard the speaker before me mention or criticize the opposition in the House of Representatives for putting forward amendments, I found it very unfortunate. But I have a deep appreciation for how fortunate we are in Trinidad and Tobago, that our democracy must be protected. And the institutions in Parliament and the various features of our system, I think, allows people to have a say. And I think we must continue to protect that and encourage that. So I trust that Senator De Freitas could appreciate that what I'm saying here is not to attack your contribution, but to implore you to take a different view, and particularly because you wear another hat as an...
Senator Amin.
Okay.
Continue.
All right. Thank you. So I just want to, as I say, implore Senator De Freitas to take that different view, that we must encourage people, especially elected persons, to have their say at all times, because this is what makes our democracy strong. Madam President, I do not intend to go clause by clause in my contribution. One of the elements of fighting terrorism, Madam President, it has been noted by the Attorney General, and it has been widely published, that Trinidad and Tobago has become one of the places for the highest recruitment of per capita for international terrorist fighters. I am happy that the Attorney General, in his opening, indicated that the idea of terrorism is not something new. It's not something unique to any particular religion. And in fact, at one time, and in fact at numerous times in the history, even in Trinidad and Tobago, groups of people who stood up for the rights of others, who chose to fight against oppression, or fight against the people who were in charge or in the government, they were labeled as terrorists. And later on, after many years, they were hailed as heroes and freedom fighters. So the idea of terrorism is not something that is new. What is unfortunate is that over the last couple decades, we have had the developments in international world politics leading to a particular religion being tarnished and as well being used as a cover for criminal activities that should be totally condemned. Words like ISIS, ISIL, terrorist attacks have become synonymous with a particular religion. In fact, Madam President, many Arabic and Islamic phrases with very positive meanings became synonymous with these criminal acts. The word Taliban means student. Allah Akbar, God means God is great. Many of you would, the Attorney General mentioned Bin Laden. Bin Laden is a name. The name Ahmed, for those of you who may know Ahmed, the dead terrorist, has become such a joke because he is a puppet in an American stand-up comedy routine. And all of those things contribute to a certain negative impression around a certain religion. And I'm happy that I think so far almost every speaker has mentioned the importance of us as a nation ensuring that we protect law-abiding citizens of all religions and allow them freedom to practice while dealing with the criminal act that is terrorism. Madam President, one of the things that was mentioned by my colleague, Senator Saddam Hussein, who had the opportunity to participate in a US program geared towards countering violent extremism, has to do with how strategies to deal with changing attitudes and behaviors. He spoke about five buckets of CVE: prevention, intervention, rehabilitation, reintegration, and research. And that it is important that CVE is not only focused on Islamic groups, but all other extremist groups. Madam President, in Trinidad and Tobago, I have seen personally where people who become the whole phenomenon of radicalization, and some of the factors that lead to radicalization are a great cause for concern for me. We talk about the situational, what are the pre-existing conditions in terms of the social climate that allow people to feel marginalized, to feel a sense of injustice, to feel disenfranchised, that would cause them to become susceptible or vulnerable to radicalization. We talk about the fact that people are exposed to principles or beliefs about what is good for society, and that they may well believe that their cause is a noble one. And many who are vulnerable and who become agents or who become recruits, unfortunately, they are misled. And I feel it is very important, while we talk about dealing with it from a law enforcement point of view, that we speak about the prevention part and the responsibility of not of the government as well, from national security perspective, but even within our communities, that our communities are empowered to deal with those issues that arise within the communities or arise within, so that you don't have these, as I say, vulnerable persons being radicalized. Madam President, although it can be said that poverty is part of it, many persons who have made international media as recruits were not very poor people when you compare what happens in Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam President, I think that Trinidad and Tobago is at a stage where we have to nip it in the bud from before the stage of recruitment. I want to make a few suggestions. That the Ministry of National Security must take into consideration while the bill talks about
Honourable Senators, at this stage we will suspend and we will return at 5:35. So we are suspended until 5:35.